The man standing at the counter looked invisible to everyone except the one person who wanted him gone. His clothes were worn, his beard untrimmed, and his hands trembled slightly from exhaustion, but his eyes held something deeper than hunger. Across the polished desk, the manager smirked, convinced he was dealing with just another homeless man who had wandered into the wrong place. Staff members glanced, whispered, and quietly laughed, assuming the scene would end like so many others, with security escorting him out. What none of them noticed was the way he observed everything, memorizing faces, gestures, and the tone of humiliation being handed to him. And when the manager mockingly suggested that $5 could make him leave forever, the room filled with quiet amusement. They had no idea that the moment they laughed would become the moment they would regret for the rest of their lives. Before the story unfolds, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story for more powerful, true-inspired stories that matter. The building stood in the center downtown like a symbol of modern charity, a place marketed as a community resource center that claimed to help the vulnerable rebuild their lives. Its glass doors, polished floors, and bright reception desk gave the impression of professionalism and compassion. On brochures and advertisements, it was described as a safe haven, a bridge between hardship and hope. But beneath its clean appearance, there existed an unspoken hierarchy that determined who was welcomed warmly and who was tolerated reluctantly. That morning, the lobby was unusually busy. Volunteers moved quickly, checking paperwork, handing out forms, and guiding visitors toward designated waiting areas. Most of the staff had grown accustomed to seeing people from all walks of life walk through those doors, yet their reactions often depended on appearance more than need. When the older black man stepped inside, the energy in the room subtly shifted. His name was Elijah Carter, though no one asked for it first. His shoes were worn thin, and his jacket, once sturdy, now carried the marks of years spent battling harsh weather and harder circumstances. His posture showed fatigue, but not defeat. There was dignity in the way he stood, even as his presence drew uncomfortable glances. Elijah had spent years drifting between temporary shelters, odd jobs, and long nights under uncertain roofs. Life had not unraveled overnight for him. It had been a slow erosion caused by layoffs, medical bills, and a system that seemed to close doors faster than it opened them. Once, he had been a skilled technician who repaired public infrastructure equipment for municipal projects. But after an injury and a legal dispute with a contractor, his career collapsed, and with it, the stability he had spent decades building. Still, he never begged. He never caused scenes. He carried himself quietly, observing more than speaking, absorbing more than reacting. As he approached the reception desk, the manager on duty, a sharply dressed man named Richard Hale, barely looked up at first. Richard had built a reputation among staff as efficient but impatient, especially with individuals he assumed were unlikely to contribute financially to the organization's image or donor statistics. Elijah placed his worn backpack gently on the floor and waited. Instead of being greeted with courtesy, he was met with a long pause and a subtle sigh from behind the desk. Richard finally looked up, his eyes scanning Elijah from head to toe with a judgment that required no words. The glance lingered just long enough to communicate dismissal. Around them, employees exchanged brief looks. Some pretended to stay focused on their paperwork, while others watched discreetly, curiosity mixed with quiet bias. To them, Elijah seemed like just another homeless man hoping for assistance in a place that was known for selective generosity. The irony was that the building's public image revolved around inclusivity and outreach. Posters on the walls showed smiling, diverse faces, slogans about equality, and messages about second chances. But the unspoken reality inside the lobby often contradicted those ideals. Elijah's presence at the desk created tension not because he was loud or disruptive, but because he represented a truth the organization preferred to manage quietly rather than confront openly. He was the type of person their marketing claimed to support, yet their daily operations often struggled to treat with genuine respect. As minutes passed, the manager's impatience grew more visible. Papers were shuffled with unnecessary force. The tapping of a pen against the counter echoed louder than it should have in a room filled with soft background noise. Meanwhile, Elijah remained calm. He looked around the lobby slowly, studying the framed awards on the wall, the donor plaques, and the mission statement written in bold lettering about dignity and compassion. His eyes lingered on those words longer than most people would have noticed. There was history in his gaze. Years earlier, Elijah had helped install the electrical systems for several buildings across the city, including facilities funded by the same organization now standing before him. Back then, he had been respected, paid fairly, and acknowledged for his expertise. But life had shifted dramatically since those days, and recognition had vanished with stability. To the staff in the lobby, he was now just another anonymous figure shaped by hardship. A young employee nearby whispered something to a colleague, and they both exchanged a small laugh, quickly hiding it behind forced professionalism. Their reaction was subtle, but not invisible. Elijah noticed. He always noticed. Despite everything he had endured, he carried a quiet awareness sharpened by years of being underestimated. He understood how rooms changed when he entered them, how assumptions formed before introductions, and how dignity was often measured by clothing rather than character. Still, he stood there patiently, as if he believed that patience alone could soften the atmosphere. But the atmosphere did not soften. Instead, it hardened, and the moment that would define everyone in that room was only seconds away from unfolding. The tension that filled the lobby grew heavier as Richard finally leaned forward, his expression tightening with visible irritation. From his perspective, the situation was simple. A visibly homeless man had walked into a polished administrative center during peak hours, and he assumed the encounter would follow a predictable pattern: request, refusal, and removal. What he failed to realize was that his assumptions were already shaping his behavior in ways that would soon become impossible to undo. Elijah remained silent, not out of weakness, but out of restraint. His life had taught him that speaking too quickly in hostile environments often invited escalation. Silence, on the other hand, revealed more than arguments ever could. The manager's voice carried across the counter, with a tone that was neither welcoming nor neutral. It was the tone of someone who had already made up his mind before the interaction even began. Staff members nearby pretended to focus on their tasks, yet their attention stayed fixed on the unfolding scene. Some observed with mild discomfort, others with quiet amusement, and a few with indifference. The difference in reactions reflected a deeper issue within the environment, one that went beyond a single interaction and hinted at a culture shaped by unconscious bias and selective empathy. Elijah gently placed a folded document on the counter. It was worn but carefully preserved. Inside were identification records, past employment certifications, and proof of previous contracts tied to infrastructure projects across the city. He had carried those papers for years, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a reminder of who he had been before life unraveled. Richard barely glanced at them. Instead, he focused on Elijah's appearance. To him, the worn clothing overshadowed credentials. The backpack overshadowed the documentation, and the man's quiet demeanor was misinterpreted as helplessness rather than composure. In the background, a few visitors whispered among themselves, speculating about whether security would be called. The whispers were soft, but the energy of judgment was unmistakable. Elijah noticed how laughter occasionally surfaced and quickly faded, like ripples in a still pond. It was not loud mockery, but the kind of restrained amusement that often hides behind professionalism. Then came the moment that shifted the emotional gravity of the room. Richard leaned slightly over the counter, gesturing dismissively, his posture projecting authority rather than service. His expression carried the confidence of someone accustomed to control, someone who believed his role allowed him to determine who belonged and who did not. He gestured toward the lobby seating area as if directing Elijah away, signaling that the center was not a place for someone like him to linger without purpose. The implication was clear without needing explicit explanation. Staff members nearby exchanged looks. One employee suppressed a smile. Another shook their heads subtly. The scene was becoming less about policy and more about perception. Elijah's hands tightened slightly around the edge of the counter, but his face remained calm. Years of surviving difficult encounters had taught him to master emotional stillness. Internally, however, memories resurfaced, moments of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated as less than human in spaces that publicly promoted equality. He had seen this pattern before. Different buildings, different faces, the same assumptions. Meanwhile, the manager's tone grew sharper, layered with a casual arrogance that suggested he believed the situation was under complete control. In his mind, humor was an acceptable tool to assert dominance in uncomfortable encounters. That was when the remark was made, the one that triggered quiet laughter from a few corners of the room. It was delivered with a smirk, framed as a sarcastic suggestion that if Elijah had even a small amount of money, he should use it to leave rather than remain in a place that was not meant for him. The staff's restrained laughter filled the air for a brief moment. It was not explosive. It was worse. It was dismissive, and dismissiveness often cuts deeper than open hostility. Elijah did not respond immediately. Instead, he slowly lifted his gaze and looked around the room again, observing the reactions of every individual present. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked curious. A few appeared uncomfortable, as if sensing that something about the situation was ethically wrong, but choosing silence over intervention. The building's mission statement on the wall now seemed painfully ironic. Compassion, dignity, opportunity. Words that looked impressive in print, but fragile in practice. What the room did not realize was that Elijah's silence was not submission. It was calculation. He had spent years navigating bureaucratic systems, legal paperwork, and institutional structures. He understood how documentation, observation, and timing could transform a moment of humiliation into undeniable evidence of misconduct. And he had already begun documenting everything long before stepping through those glass doors. His worn backpack, overlooked by everyone, contained more than personal belongings. Inside were neatly organized files, letters from advocacy groups, and a recording device he used to document encounters with public service organizations. Not out of paranoia, but out of necessity, because experience had taught him one painful truth. People often behave differently when they believe no one is watching. As the subtle laughter faded, an uneasy silence replaced it. The atmosphere shifted slightly, though no one could yet explain why. Elijah's composure began to unsettle the room more than any reaction would have. He was not pleading. He was not arguing. He was observing. And observation, when paired with patience, can be more powerful than confrontation. Meanwhile, Richard's confidence remained intact. He interpreted Elijah's silence as defeat, not realizing that the absence of resistance sometimes signals the presence of strategy. In his mind, the situation was nearly over, but in reality, it was only beginning. The turning point came not with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with a single deliberate movement. Elijah slowly reached into his backpack and retrieved a thin folder. The room, still carrying remnants of earlier laughter, paid little attention at first. To most observers, it appeared to be just another document, another attempt to prove eligibility or request assistance. But the weight of that folder was far greater than anyone expected. He placed it gently on the counter and opened it with careful precision. Inside were letters bearing official seals, certifications, and most notably, a recent partnership evaluation report tied directly to the organization that operated the building. Richard's expression shifted slightly as his eyes caught the official insignia. Confusion replaced amusement. For the first time, he looked at the documents rather than the man. The report detailed a city-funded audit concerning accessibility, discrimination complaints, and operational transparency among community service centers. The very facility they stood in was listed as one of the organizations under review. And Elijah Carter was not merely a visitor. He was a documented participant in the audit process. Months earlier, advocacy groups working alongside municipal oversight committees had selected individuals with lived experiences of homelessness and systemic bias to evaluate how service centers treated vulnerable populations. Elijah, with his technical background and detailed record-keeping habits, had been chosen for his observational skills and resilience. He had visited multiple facilities quietly, documenting interactions without revealing his role until necessary. This building was his final evaluation site. The realization spread across the manager's face slowly, like a shadow overtaking light. The laughter in the room had completely vanished. Staff members who had previously watched with amusement now leaned forward, their expressions tightening with concern. The atmosphere shifted from casual dismissal to palpable tension. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply allowed the documentation to speak. The audit report included timestamps, observational notes, and recorded behavioral assessments of staff interactions. Attached to it were preliminary findings highlighting patterns of selective treatment based on appearance, socioeconomic status, and racial perception. Every moment in the lobby had already been noted. Every reaction had already been observed. Every assumption had already been documented. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Richard's posture changed dramatically. The confident lean over the counter was replaced by rigid stillness. His earlier smirk disappeared, replaced by an expression caught between disbelief and realization. The staff members who had laughed now looked visibly unsettled. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Others appeared frozen, as if replaying their behavior in their minds and recognizing the implications too late. Elijah's calm presence now carried an entirely different meaning. He was no longer seen as a homeless man seeking help. He was now understood as a witness to their conduct. And the weight of that shift was undeniable. The room felt smaller, quieter, heavier. The polished lobby that once symbolized authority now felt like a stage where every action had been exposed under an invisible spotlight. Elijah closed the folder slowly, his movement steady and controlled. His eyes moved across the room one final time, not with anger, but with a quiet disappointment that resonated more deeply than outrage ever could. This was not the first time he had been underestimated. But this time, the underestimation carried consequences far beyond personal humiliation, because the audit was not about revenge. It was about accountability, and accountability had finally arrived. In the weeks that followed, the incident inside the lobby became a pivotal case study within the city's oversight review. Internal investigations were launched, policies were examined, and staff training protocols were re-evaluated with urgency. The organization that once prided itself on public compassion now faced scrutiny that extended beyond public relations. Reports highlighted inconsistencies between their mission statements and their real-world conduct, revealing how subtle biases could shape service delivery in ways that contradicted their foundational values. For many employees, the experience became a moment of self-reflection rather than punishment alone. Training sessions were restructured to address unconscious bias, dignity-centered service, and ethical accountability. Workshops emphasized that respect should never be conditional upon appearance or financial status. Richard's career trajectory changed significantly after the investigation. While he was not publicly shamed, he was removed from managerial duties and reassigned under strict oversight. The organization acknowledged that leadership behavior sets the tone for workplace culture, and his actions had demonstrated a critical lapse in judgment. But the story's true impact extended far beyond administrative consequences. It transformed how the facility interacted with the community. New policies required staff to treat every visitor with equal respect regardless of visible circumstances. Observation protocols were implemented to ensure accountability in frontline interactions. Most importantly, the organization partnered with advocacy groups to include lived experience consultants in future operational planning. Elijah, meanwhile, continued his work quietly. He did not seek recognition. He did not pursue publicity. His goal had never been to expose individuals, but to reveal systemic patterns that often go unnoticed in everyday interactions. His presence in that lobby had not been accidental. It had been intentional, purposeful, and deeply rooted in a commitment to improving how vulnerable individuals are treated. Months later, the same lobby felt different. Staff greeted visitors more attentively. Laughter was replaced by professionalism. Judgment was replaced by awareness. And the mission statement on the wall finally began to reflect genuine effort rather than mere branding. The most profound change, however, was internal. Many employees later admitted that the moment of laughter haunted them more than any formal consequence. It forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. That prejudice does not always appear as overt hostility. Sometimes it hides in assumptions, dismissive tones, and subtle mockery disguised as humor. Elijah's silent dignity had exposed that truth without a single confrontation. His story became a training reference across multiple service centers in the city, illustrating how easily bias can influence behavior when empathy is replaced by judgment. Advocacy groups cited the case as an example of why lived experience evaluations are essential in assessing institutional fairness. Years of invisibility had given Elijah a unique perspective on how systems operate when they believe they are unobserved. And through quiet documentation, he had turned one moment of humiliation into a catalyst for lasting reform. In the end, the lesson was not about one manager or one building. It was about how society often treats those who appear powerless. Because dignity should never depend on clothing, respect should never depend on wealth, and humanity should never depend on perception. The man they laughed at did not seek revenge. He sought accountability. And in doing so, he changed an entire institution's approach to compassion. His story serves as a powerful reminder that every interaction carries weight, every assumption carries consequences, and every act of disrespect reveals more about the observer than the person being judged. Sometimes, the people we underestimate are the very ones who hold a mirror up to our character. And sometimes, the quietest individuals leave the loudest impact. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story for more powerful, emotional stories that inspire awareness, justice, and change.